Well, for more on what's developing this week in the region, and there's plenty to happen, let's bring in the Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Defence Strategy and National Security Program, Michael Shoebridge. Michael, thank you very much for your time. The Solomon Islands blocking Australian aid workers from entering the country as it welcomes Chinese advisors. That's a bit more than just siding with China. It's an out-and-out snub of Australia, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Chris. But, I put this down to Sogavare as a person. Now, we can talk about policy failures by the previous government, but really we downplay Sogavare's individual role in this. He sees himself staying in power supported by Chinese money and maybe even Chinese security forces. I don't think much is going to turn him from that course because Beijing is rewarding him for behaving as he is. And frankly, they love him splitting the Pacific Island Forum in the way that he is. So if I was Prime Minister Albanese, I'd have very low expectations indeed, as you mentioned, for a meeting with Sogavare. I think we've got to start talking to the Solomons people, and we've got to start meeting with the democratic forces in the Solomons, which include the opposition. And that's something our government needs to get its mind around fast.
They sure do, and the opposition itself in Honiara are angry that they haven't been in any relationship with Australian diplomats or any relationship with the Australian government. That is in need of change. Now, Foreign Minister Penny Wong has met with her counterpart Wang Yi to begin repairs to the relationship. It follows comments from China blaming the coalition government as the root cause for bilateral breakdowns. What do you make of Wang Yi's list of 4 demands, including being positive about Beijing? Positiveness, they said. No, we've lost Michael Shoebridge. We've got him back, have we? Let's go again. Michael, did you hear that question? OK, go right ahead.
I only had to start. Well, these demands are really not new news. The idea that Australia needs to focus on the areas of agreement and shelve our differences, well, that worked for the years before China was so aggressive and pushing itself into our near region. If the Chinese weren't doing what they're doing in the South China Sea, including dangerous manoeuvres near our military aircraft, and wasn't pushing itself into the South Pacific like we were just talking about, we could shelve differences. But we can't because China is acting so aggressively and so obviously. And the idea that we can paint a positive picture of Beijing for the Australian public, well, we can't paint a positive picture of Beijing while Beijing, through its actions, is painting such an ugly picture of itself. So these new demands are really old wine in new bottles. And I just note that China's in a list handing out mood. It gave the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, 4 lists in their meeting in the margins of the G20. So Australia's not dealing with the China that's behaving like this by ourselves. Many of our partners are dealing with the same behaviour from Beijing.
That's fascinating. And just finally, new details have emerged about the assassination of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. According to a local broadcaster, the suspect told investigators he initially planned to use explosives to carry out the attack, but later decided to use a homemade gun instead. It is a frightening development for world leaders who think they are safe in the public domain and a great loss to the world.
Well, yes. I mean, Japanese political leaders are used to being able to go to the cafe and walk the dog without any kind of security detachment, with the kind of freedom that we see here in Australia. It's an important part of living in a free democracy. So this is a real aberration in Japan. Weapons are even harder to come by than they are in Australia. So I hope that they don't deal with this horrible event by overreacting and changing the openness of Japanese society. It's still one of the safest places on the planet to live. And really, the Japanese ruling party, the LDP, has already benefited from the assassination in a horrible way. They've now got a majority for constitutional change in the parliament. And some of that shows the outpouring of Japanese people's support for Shinzo Abe.
Yeah, I can just imagine. Michael Shoebridge, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Chris.